The distress call, 5 to 7 minute hook. The quiet of space was broken by a sudden signal, a transmission so weak and desperate, it barely reached the Deathworlders fleet. Far away on a peaceful planet known as Eldara, the Eldari people were living in harmony. Their cities were filled with music and laughter, and their skies were always clear. The Eldari had never known war or conflict. They were a gentle race, peaceful to their core, and their world was one of beauty and calm. But all of that was about to change. In the dead of night, their planet's calm was shattered. Without warning, dark shapes appeared in the sky. They were not ships from any race the Eldari had ever seen. The invaders came without mercy, their ships blotting out the stars. They moved like shadows, silent and deadly, descending upon Eldara with the cold efficiency of a predator stalking its prey. The invaders did not speak. They simply attacked. Within moments, entire cities were in flames. The Eldari, caught off guard, stood no chance against the invaders' ruthless technology. The invaders' weapons were far beyond anything the Eldari had ever encountered. Their laser cannons turned buildings to dust, and their soldiers, clad in dark armor, moved through the streets, capturing and killing anyone in their path. The Eldari were helpless, unable to defend themselves. The Eldari Council, desperate to save their people, did the only thing they could. They sent out a call for help. But it wasn't just any message. It was a cry, a plea for survival. The Eldari sent out a distress signal, one that echoed across the galaxy, reaching distant stars, desperate to find any kind of aid. But who would answer? The message was simple, but it carried the weight of their entire species' survival. Help us or we all die. It wasn't a message of hope. It wasn't a message of peace. It was a message of fear. The Eldari had never known such fear before. They had never faced an enemy that could wipe them out in an instant. But now, with their world under siege, they knew they had no choice but to reach out to the stars. Far away, in a distant corner of the galaxy, the message was received. The transmission came through the Deathworlders fleet, a race of beings unlike any the Eldari had ever encountered. The Deathworlders were feared across the galaxy for one thing: their reputation. They were the most dangerous warriors in existence. The Deathworlders had no love for peace, no tolerance for weakness, and no interest in other species' affairs. They were born on harsh worlds where survival was a daily struggle. Their lives were filled with constant battle, and their history was one of bloodshed and war. No one, not even the most powerful empires, dared to challenge them. The Deathworlders were known for one simple rule: fight or die. There were no alliances, no treaties, no negotiations. You either survived or you didn't. It was a harsh reality, but it was one that had kept the Deathworlders alive for centuries. So when the Eldari's desperate message reached them, the Deathworlders did something unexpected. They listened. At first, the message was met with silence. The crew members of the Deathworlder fleet, large and battle-worn, glanced at each other in confusion. Why would the Eldari, a peaceful race, need help? Why would they turn to the Deathworlders? Surely they had more capable allies, didn't they? But the message, simple and direct, carried a sense of urgency that could not be ignored. Help us or we all die. The words haunted the crew, echoing in their minds long after the transmission ended. The leader of the Deathworlders, a towering figure known as Kel, stood before the fleet, his face unreadable. He had known only battle his entire life. War was all he understood. His hands were scared from countless battles, his eyes cold from years of surviving on one of the deadliest worlds in the galaxy. He was a creature born for war, and he had no interest in saving weak, helpless species. But something about the Eldari's message stayed with him. It didn't make sense. The peaceful Eldari, begging for help. There was something wrong here, something Kel couldn't put his finger on. "We will respond," Kel finally said, his voice deep and commanding. The decision was made. The crew looked at him, some with disbelief. They had never interfered in the problems of other species. The Deathworlders were a race of isolationists, and they never got involved unless it was absolutely necessary. But Kel's word was law, and when he spoke, they obeyed. As the Deathworlder fleet turned its course toward Eldara, the tension began to build. What would they find when they arrived? What kind of enemy could bring the peaceful Eldari to their knees? The Deathworlders had no way of knowing, but one thing was certain. Whatever awaited them, it would be a fight unlike anything they had ever faced before. The fleet moved faster, cutting through space with deadly precision. The vast emptiness of space stretched before them, but all that lay ahead was the unknown. And the unknown was coming for them. The Deathworlders' response. The Deathworlder fleet cut through the void of space, its sleek warships gliding silently toward the distant planet of Eldara. Their engines hummed with power, the low growl of the hyperdrives echoing through the hulls of the massive ships. The silence aboard the fleet was almost unnerving. The Deathworlders were not used to such calm. They were born in the midst of chaos, raised to fight and survive on planets where life was an unrelenting struggle. In their world, survival was the only law. Kale, the leader of the fleet, stood at the command deck, his expression unreadable. He had made the decision to respond to the Eldari's distress call, but even now, doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. Why had he chosen to act? The Eldari were nothing like the Deathworlders. They were weak, peaceful, and lived in a world untouched by war. The Deathworlders, on the other hand, were born in the blood-soaked crucible of battle. They fought for survival every day, and they didn't waste their time with the struggles of other species. Yet something in that message had stirred something in Kel, a sense of something larger, something beyond the constant fighting. The crew stood at their stations, eyes fixed on their monitors. Some exchanged nervous glances, unsure of the reasoning behind their leader's decision. The Deathworlders were not a race that intervened in the affairs of others. They fought their own wars, and those who were weak were left to fend for themselves. It was how they had survived for so long. But as they neared Eldara, the feeling of unease spread among the crew like wildfire. They had received no details about the nature of the attackers, only the chilling plea for help. Help us or we all die. The words repeated in their minds, each one heavier than the last. Kale stepped forward, his imposing figure filling the room. His eyes, cold and calculating, met those of his officers. "We don't know what we will find when we arrive," he said, his voice low and steady. "But we do know one thing. If we don't respond, no one else will. And this may be the one fight that forces us to break our silence." His words were met with tense silence. The crew knew Cal well. He was a leader who never showed weakness, never doubted his decisions. If he was uncertain now, they had every reason to be on edge. The officers exchanged glances, then nodded in agreement. Despite their doubts, they trusted Cal. The fleet was one of the deadliest in the galaxy, and if anyone could handle whatever awaited them on Eldara, it was the Deathworlders. They had fought in countless battles, taken on enemies that others had deemed unbeatable. But this was different. This was something they hadn't encountered before. As they neared Eldara's orbit, the fleet dropped out of hyperspace. The planet appeared before them, a serene, beautiful world with oceans of blue and continents of green. From a distance, it looked peaceful. But the message from the Eldari had made it clear that beneath the surface, something far darker was happening. The fleet moved into a defensive formation, the warships lining up around the planet like a protective barrier. Kel's voice came over the comms, calm but firm. "Prepare for landing. We're not sure what we'll find, but we are ready for anything. No mercy, no hesitation." The orders were clear. The Deathworlders were here to fight, and they would not stop until the enemy was crushed. The ships moved closer to the surface, the atmosphere of Eldara now within reach. The fleet's weapons powered up, and the tension on board the ships was palpable. The crew knew this would be a battle unlike any other, one that could change the course of history. The first signs of the invaders appeared as they descended into the atmosphere. A faint signal picked up by the fleet's scanners revealed large ships hovering in the sky above Eldora's cities. The ships were not as advanced as the Deathworlders' vessels, but they were massive and intimidating. Their designs were alien, unlike anything the Deathworlders had ever seen before. They seemed to be waiting, as if they knew the Deathworlders were coming. And then, without warning, the silence was shattered. A deep, thunderous roar echoed from the distance, an unnatural sound that sent a ripple of dread through the Deathworlders. Kel raised a hand, signaling his troops to halt. From the horizon, massive figures began to emerge, like dark shadows against the dimming sky. At first, they seemed like nothing more than distant silhouettes, but as they drew closer, the full scale of the enemy became apparent. These were no ordinary invaders. They were giants, towering figures clad in black armor, their faces obscured by menacing helmets. Each one of them carried weapons that seemed far more advanced than anything the Deathworlders had ever encountered. "Move," Kale barked. The Deathworlders sprang into action. Heavy artillery was deployed, energy shields raised, and soldiers took up their positions with practiced precision. Their weapons hummed to life, ready to unleash hell upon the invaders. But despite their confidence, a sense of unease continued to grow among the ranks. These invaders were different. They weren't like anything the Deathworlders had ever faced before. The first wave of invaders crashed into the city like a tidal wave. The ground trembled beneath their feet as they moved forward, their massive forms nearly unstoppable. The Deathworlders opened fire, their blasters sending streams of high-powered energy toward the advancing enemies. But the invaders didn't slow down. Instead, they seemed to absorb the blasts, their dark armor glowing as if the shots were having no effect. Cal's fists clenched. "They're not human," he muttered to himself, analyzing the invaders' strange resilience. This was not going to be an easy fight. The Deathworlders pressed on, their tactics honed from years of surviving on deadly worlds. They moved as a unit, each soldier working in perfect harmony with the others. Despite the invaders' seemingly indestructible armor, the Deathworlders' firepower was overwhelming. The city erupted in chaos as the two forces collided. Explosions rocked the streets, debris flying in all directions. The Deathworlders' soldiers fought with a brutal intensity, using their strength and experience to push back the invaders. But despite their superior training, they could feel the weight of the battle shifting. The invaders didn't fight like any army the Deathworlders had encountered. Their tactics were different, more ruthless, more organized. It was as though they had been expecting the Deathworlders all along. As the battle raged on, Cal's mind raced. Who were these invaders? How had they known the Deathworlders would come? And more importantly, how could they fight an enemy that didn't seem to fear their weapons? The Deathworlders had faced enemies that were powerful, but never like this. A sense of dread filled the air as the battle began to take a turn. The Deathworlders were beginning to lose ground. Despite their overwhelming strength, they were facing an enemy that was far more dangerous than they had anticipated. They had no idea what they were truly up against. The question lingered in the back of Cal's mind. Could they win this fight? Could they survive against an enemy that had already turned their world upside down? The unknown enemy. The battle raged on, but the Deathworlders found themselves pushed back further into the ruins of Eldora's capital. The invaders were unlike any enemy they had ever faced. Their movements were synchronized, their tactics precise. They didn't falter, they didn't hesitate. It was as if they knew exactly what the Deathworlders were going to do before they did it. Cal's thoughts raced as he surveyed the battlefield. The invaders' dark armor shimmered in the fading light of Eldora's twin suns, their weapons cutting through the air with deadly accuracy. It wasn't just their strength that made them dangerous. It was their tactics. The Deathworlders were known for their brutal, aggressive style of combat. They struck first, hit hard, and never backed down. But the invaders didn't react in the same way. They weren't intimidated by the Deathworlders' overwhelming power. Instead, they adapted, countering every move with a cold, calculating precision. Kel's mind snapped back to the present as a heavy explosion rocked the ground beneath his feet. He spun, raising his weapon just in time to fire at an invader who had appeared from the shadows. The blast sent the enemy soldier flying backward, but Kel's relief was short-lived. The invader quickly regained its footing, its armor undamaged, and moved to engage again. "What are they?" Kel muttered under his breath, his eyes scanning the battlefield. No enemy he had ever encountered could withstand this kind of onslaught. The Deathworlders' weapons were designed to obliterate even the toughest of opponents, yet these invaders didn't even flinch. The answer to Kel's question came in the form of a chilling realization. These weren't just soldiers. They were something far more dangerous, something not entirely of this world. "Kel," one of his officers shouted from across the battlefield, his voice thick with urgency. "We've got a problem. They're adapting. Every time we adjust our tactics, they do the same. It's like they're reading our moves." Kel's eyes narrowed. "Damn it," he cursed. He had feared as much. The invaders weren't just soldiers. They were more like predators, studying their prey, learning from every move the Deathworlders made. Every step forward seemed to take them 2 steps back. No matter how hard they fought, no matter how many invaders they took down, there were always more. And each one seemed to get stronger, faster, more prepared for the Deathworlders' next attack. "Fall back to the main compound," Kel ordered, his voice booming across the comms. "We need to regroup and rethink our strategy." But even as the Deathworlders retreated to their last bastion, Kel couldn't shake the feeling that the invaders were already waiting for them. The distance between them seemed to shrink with every passing moment. The ground trembled as the invaders moved in, their footsteps heavy, purposeful. When the Deathworlders reached the main compound, they quickly set up defensive positions. Kel watched his soldiers with a mixture of concern and admiration. They were tough, they were fearless, and they were the best the galaxy had to offer. But even they couldn't overcome an enemy that seemed to know every move they made before they made it. "We need answers," Kel muttered to himself. He knew they couldn't keep up this fight forever. If they couldn't figure out who these invaders were or how to stop them, they wouldn't survive. The Eldari didn't stand a chance. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden shift in the air, a low hum, followed by a loud, sharp crack. Kel spun around, raising his weapon as a massive figure emerged from the smoke and debris. It was taller than any of the invaders they had seen before, its armor gleaming in the dim light, and it exuded an aura of power. "Prepare yourselves," Kel ordered, his voice steady despite the rising tension. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as the massive invader stepped forward, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The creature's voice, low, distorted, and mechanical, sounded through the air, sending a chill down Kel's spine. "You cannot defeat us. You cannot stop us. We are the harbingers of your extinction." The words echoed in Kel's mind as he prepared for the fight of his life. The invaders were no longer just a threat. They were an unstoppable force. And Kel realized, with a sickening certainty, that their victory would not come easily. "We will not go down without a fight," Kel snarled, raising his weapon once more. The creature's laughter filled the air. "You will fight, yes, but in the end, it will not matter. Your strength, your weapons, your fury, it means nothing. We are beyond your understanding." With that, the creature lunged forward, its movements faster than Kel could react. He fired his weapon, but it didn't slow the creature down. Instead, the invader moved with a speed that defied logic, dodging the attack as if it had anticipated every move. Kel barely had time to react before the creature's massive fist slammed into his chest. The impact sent him flying backward, crashing into the reinforced wall of the compound. Pain exploded in his chest, but he forced himself to his feet, determination burning in his eyes. "You cannot stop us," the creature repeated, its voice a distorted growl. "The invasion has already begun." Cale stumbled to his feet, blood dripping from his mouth. The creature was right. They were up against something far greater than they had ever imagined. The Deathworlders were powerful, but they weren't invincible. And against an enemy that could predict their every move, they were vulnerable. "Not today," Cale whispered, blood staining his teeth. He wasn't ready to give up yet. There had to be a way to fight back. There had to be a weakness. But before he could make another move, the invaders' massive army began to pour into the compound, surrounding them on all sides. It was clear now. The Deathworlders were no longer the hunters. They were the prey. A glimmer of hope. The Deathworlders were surrounded, their backs pressed against the cold, reinforced walls of the main compound, with the invaders closing in from every direction. Cale's chest ached from the blow he'd taken, but the pain didn't matter. The enemy was closing in, and time was running out. He could feel the weight of the battle bearing down on him and his soldiers. The air was thick with tension as they prepared for what would likely be their final stand. Cale surveyed the battlefield, his sharp mind working furiously. The invaders' strength was overwhelming, their tactics beyond anything the Deathworlders had ever encountered. And that creature, whatever it was, had nearly crushed him in one hit. But something about its words lingered in his mind. "We are beyond your understanding." What did it mean? What made these invaders so powerful? They had technology that the Deathworlders had never seen, and they could predict their every move. But there had to be a weakness, something that could give them a chance. Cale wasn't ready to surrender, not yet. He turned to his officers, their faces grim but determined. They were exhausted, battered, but they had fought to the last. "We're not finished yet," Cale said, his voice low but fierce. "There's something we're missing. We've been fighting their forces, but we haven't fought the heart of the invasion. There's something behind all this, the way they know our every move. We need to find it, and fast." A young officer, bloodied and panting, stepped forward. "Cale, I think I know what it is." Cale raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Go on." The officer swallowed hard. "We've been so focused on the enemy's power, we didn't realize that their strength might come from something else. They're not just using advanced tech. They're using something else. Something alien." Cale's eyes widened. "What are you talking about?" The officer nodded. "The scans we've taken, they show an unusual energy source coming from deep within the invaders' ranks. I think they're using some sort of psychic network, a link that connects them. It's like they're all one mind, working together, anticipating every move. That's how they've been able to stay one step ahead of us. Their strength isn't just in their armor or weapons, it's in their collective consciousness." Cale felt a chill run down his spine. A psychic link. It was an unsettling thought. It meant that these invaders were not just powerful. They were connected, communicating in ways that no single Deathworlder could ever hope to match. "But if that's true," Cale said slowly, "then we need to find a way to sever that connection. If we can disrupt their psychic link, we can cripple them." The officer nodded, his expression determined. "That's what I believe. If we can target the central node, wherever that is, we might be able to break their hold on the battlefield. It won't be easy, but it's our only shot." Cale's mind raced. This was their glimmer of hope, but it came at a steep price. The invaders were everywhere, their overwhelming numbers closing in from every direction. Getting close enough to target their central node would be nearly impossible without suffering devastating losses. Yet they had no choice. It was now or never. He turned to his soldiers, his voice steady. "Listen up. We have one chance to turn this around. Our enemy's strength comes from their psychic network. If we can take it down, they'll be just like any other enemy we've faced. We can win this. But it's going to be dangerous, and many of us won't make it out. If we fail, we die here. If we succeed, we save Eldara. We save everything." Are you with me?" A chorus of determined voices echoed back at him, each soldier ready for the fight ahead. "Yes, Kale. We're with you." The Deathworlders prepared for what could be their final charge. With grim determination, they split into small teams, each one assigned to a specific task. Kale and his most trusted officers would lead the way to the heart of the enemy's forces, the location of the psychic node. As they moved out, Kale couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. This was their last chance. The invaders were closing in, their presence overwhelming, but the Deathworlders fought for more than just victory. They fought for survival, for a future where they could live on their own terms, free from the oppression of any other force. The stakes had never been higher. The streets of Eldara were in chaos as the Deathworlders moved through the city, pushing forward with everything they had. Their weapons flashed brightly, and their energy shields hummed as they fought their way through wave after wave of invaders. But despite their ferocity, the enemy was relentless. They didn't stop. They didn't retreat. Each wave seemed stronger than the last. Cal's team moved deeper into the heart of the city, towards the location the officer had pinpointed. They could feel the psychic pressure building with each step. It was as if the air itself was thick with the invaders' power, pressing down on them, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. The psychic link was becoming stronger, and with it, the invaders' power seemed to increase. But Kel wouldn't stop. He couldn't. Every step they took brought them closer to their goal. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of fighting, they'd reached the center of the psychic node, an ancient, towering structure deep within the city. It was surrounded by the invaders' soldiers, all of them standing motionless, as if they were waiting for something. Kale raised his weapon, signaling for his team to take position. This was it, the last battle. If they could take down the node, they could break the invaders' control and turn the tide of the war. "Ready yourselves," Kale whispered, his eyes fixed on the glowing, pulsating core of the node. "This is our moment." And then, all at once, they attacked. The fall of the node. The battle reached a fever pitch as Kale and his team stormed toward the heart of the invaders' psychic network. The ancient tower loomed before them, its dark stone surface seeming to pulse with an otherworldly energy. Every step forward felt like it came at a greater cost, the weight of the psychic pressure almost unbearable. The invaders around them fought with a savage intensity, as if they could sense the threat the Deathworlders posed. Cal's heart pounded in his chest as they pushed forward. His team fought with everything they had, using their weapons to mow down invader after invader. But the closer they got to the node, the more overwhelming the psychic presence became. It was like a storm in their minds, relentless, oppressive, pushing them to their limits. The invaders didn't need to say a word. Their actions, their sheer will, were enough to send waves of agony through the Deathworlders. It was as if they were facing an enemy that could not just predict their moves, but sense their very thoughts. "Keep pushing," Kale barked, his voice strong despite the mounting pressure. "We're almost there." His officers nodded, grim determination etched on their faces. They were close, but the invaders knew it too. The air felt thick with tension, and every corner they turned brought them face to face with more of the enemy. But Kale and his team were driven by a single purpose: to break the psychic link that had made the invaders nearly unstoppable. They'd reached the base of the tower, and Kale's gaze locked on the glowing, pulsating core at its summit. It was the heart of the psychic network, the source of the invaders' power. If they could destroy it, they might have a chance at victory. But that meant getting to it first, and the path was lined with enemy soldiers, all of them seemingly aware of their every move. "Cover fire," Kale shouted, raising his weapon to fire at the advancing invaders. The air crackled with the energy of their weapons as they laid down suppressive fire. It wasn't enough to stop the invaders, but it bought them precious seconds. The team pressed on, using every ounce of their strength and training to clear a path. But the closer they got, the more dangerous it became. The invaders seemed to sense their desperation. They fought with a frenzied intensity, their movements growing faster, more coordinated. They were no longer just soldiers. They were a force of nature, driven by a collective will, each one working in perfect harmony. "We have to get to the top," Kel growled, his teeth gritted in frustration. "We can't let them keep us down here." The climb to the summit of the tower was grueling, the invaders on their tail every step of the way. Kel's muscles burned, his body screaming for rest, but he refused to stop. The psychic pressure was nearly suffocating now, as if the invaders were aware of every passing thought. The higher they climbed, the more intense the sensation became. It was as though the tower itself was alive, pulsing with an energy that twisted the very air around them. Finally, they reached the top. Kel stood before the node, a massive structure of shifting energy and dark matter. It hummed with a power that seemed to echo through his very bones. The psychic link was strongest here, the pressure nearly unbearable. Kel could feel his mind being pushed to the brink, every thought a struggle against the overwhelming force that pressed in on him from all sides. "Now," Kel ordered, his voice trained but determined, "we take it down." His soldiers quickly set to work, planting explosive charges around the node's base. But before they could finish, the air around them seemed to shift. The invaders, hundreds of them, had gathered at the base of the tower. And at the front of the group stood the massive, imposing figure of the creature Kel had faced earlier, the one who had nearly crushed him with a single blow. It towered over the Deathworlders, its glowing eyes locked onto Kel with an unsettling calm. "You are too late," it said, its voice deep and distorted. "The node is already beyond your reach. Your efforts are meaningless." Kel's fists clenched around his weapon. "We'll see about that." With a roar, he and his team launched themselves at the invaders, firing with everything they had. The battle intensified as the invaders retaliated, their weapons lashing out with deadly force. But the Deathworlders were relentless. Every shot they fired was a promise of destruction, every strike a testament to their will to survive. The creature moved forward, its massive form surging with power. Kel couldn't afford to let it get close. If the invader reached the node, they would have no hope of stopping the psychic link. "Focus fire," Kel shouted, leading the charge. "We're not letting them win." For every invader they took down, two more seemed to appear in their place. But Kel's team fought with a single-minded determination. This was it, their last stand. If they didn't stop the psychic network now, they would lose everything. As the battle raged around him, Kel's mind raced. He had to stop the node. He had to. The future of Eldara, no, the future of every living being, depended on it. The explosive charges were set. Kel signaled to his team, "Detonate on my mark." But before they could trigger the explosion, the creature lunged forward, its immense strength throwing Kel aside like a ragdoll. Pain exploded through his body, but Kel fought through it, pushing himself to his feet. The creature raised its weapon high, preparing to strike. "You will not stop us," it snarled. But Kel didn't hesitate. He reached for the detonator, his fingers trembling as he pressed the button. The explosion that followed was deafening. The entire tower trembled as the psychic node shattered into 1,000 pieces, the energy contained within it erupting in a massive shockwave. The invaders, caught in the blast, were thrown back as the psychic link that had held them together began to crumble. Kel's vision blurred from the force of the explosion, but he could hear the chaos around him. The invaders' movements slowed, their precision faltering. The pressure in the air lifted, and for the first time, Kel felt like he could breathe. He staggered to his feet, his body bruised and battered, but his mind clear. The node was gone. The invaders' power was broken. The Deathworlders had won. But at what cost? A new dawn. The battlefield lay in ruins. The once pristine streets of Eldara's capital were now scorched and littered with the wreckage of battle. The air was thick with smoke, the remnants of the psychic shockwave still lingering, a faint hum that whispered in the minds of the Deathworlders. Kale stood at the center of it all, battered, bloodied, but alive. His soldiers, though weary and bruised, stood beside him. They had done it. They had won. The invaders, their collective psychic link shattered, were no longer the unstoppable force they had once been. But as the dust settled and the silence crept in, Cal couldn't help but feel a deep sense of unease. The victory, though hard-won, felt hollow. The cost had been too high. So many lives had been lost in the battle. So many comrades had fallen. Cale looked around at the fallen warriors, both Deathworlders and Eldari alike. They had fought side by side, united against a common enemy. The Deathworlders had shown their strength, their ferocity, but it wasn't just their power that had made the difference. It was their resolve, their determination to survive against impossible odds. And yet, the cost of victory was not something they could ignore. Cale. The voice broke through his thoughts. He turned to see Captain Syrah, one of his most trusted officers, walking toward him. Her face was smeared with dirt and blood, but her eyes still held the fire of determination. "We did it," she said, her voice quiet but filled with pride. "We stopped them." Cale nodded slowly. "Yes, we did. But at what cost?" His gaze swept across the battlefield, lingering on the bodies of those who had given everything. His mind returned to the moment when the explosion had torn through the psychic node. The invaders had been thrown into chaos, their unity fractured, but not without consequences. The Deathworlders had pushed forward, but the victory had been costly. The node had been destroyed, but many of his best soldiers hadn't made it out alive. "We lost a lot of good people," Syrah said, her voice heavy with sorrow. "Too many." Cal's expression hardened, but there was a deep sadness in his eyes. He couldn't deny the truth. The Deathworlders had survived, but the Eldari, their allies, had not. The destruction was immense. Entire city blocks had been leveled, and the once proud structures that had stood for millennia were reduced to rubble. The Eldari had lost everything, their homes, their families, their culture. They had fought bravely, but in the end, they had been swept away by the tide of war. "We'll rebuild," Cale said, his voice firm. "We'll help them rebuild." Syrah nodded, though her face remained troubled. "It won't be easy." "No," Cale agreed, "but we have to try. For them. For all of us." As Cale stood there, contemplating the enormity of the task ahead, he was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. A figure emerged from the haze, an Eldari elder, their robes flowing gracefully despite the carnage around them. The elder's face was lined with age and sorrow, but there was a flicker of gratitude in their eyes as they approached Cale. "You've saved us," the elder said, their voice soft but clear. "The Deathworlders have given us a chance to live, to rebuild." Cale bowed his head in respect. "We did what had to be done. But it's not over yet. There's much work to be done, and we'll stand beside you, as allies." The elder's eyes shimmered with emotion. "You are not just our allies. You are our saviors. The price you've paid. Your people will not be forgotten." Cale felt a lump form in his throat. It was worth it. "We couldn't let you fall. No one deserves that." The elder reached out and placed a hand on Cale's shoulder, a silent gesture of gratitude and solidarity. "You will always have a place here, Deathworlders. You have proven that you are more than conquerors, you are protectors. And in time, we will heal. Together." The words hung in the air, a promise for the future. The victory had come at a cost, but it had also forged an unbreakable bond between the Deathworlders and the Eldari. Their alliance, once tenuous, was now strong and unshakable. They had fought together, bled together, and now they would rebuild together. Cale turned to his soldiers, his heart swelling with pride despite the sorrow. They had faced the unimaginable, and they had won. But the fight for survival wasn't over. The galaxy was vast, and there would be other threats, other enemies, but the Deathworlders were no longer alone. They had forged new alliances, and in those alliances, they would find strength. "We've lost much," Cale said, his voice rising with conviction. "But we've gained something even greater. We've gained a future we'll build together." And as the sun set over the ruined city of Eldara, Cale stood tall, knowing that their struggle wasn't just for survival, it was for something more. For a future where the Deathworlders would no longer be outcasts, but protectors. For a future where the galaxy would no longer be a place of endless war, but a place of hope, where even the darkest days could be followed by a new dawn.